The slow, agonizing process of starving to death. Think about your body consuming itself, muscle by muscle, over the course of several long weeks. Now imagine enduring that torture while sitting inside a warm shelter, surrounded by enough military-grade food to feed an entire squad for a year. This isn't a riddle or a dark fantasy. It is the terrifying, illogical reality of how Ted Wire died. The date was February 24th, 1978. In the quiet agricultural hub of Yuba City, California, it was a typical Friday, the kind of crisp winter evening that promised excitement for 5 local men. They were a tight-knit group, often referred to by their families simply as the boys. They ranged in age from 24 to 32, men who navigated the world with a mix of gentle innocence and a reliance on structured routine. That night, they piled into a turquoise and white 1969 Mercury Montego, bound for Chico to cheer on their favorite college basketball team. It was supposed to be a night of simple pleasures, soda, snacks, and the thrill of cheering from the bleachers. They had a schedule they followed religiously. They had a plan, and most importantly, they had families waiting up for them to return home. But as the stadium lights dimmed and they drove away into the darkness, they didn't head back toward the safety of the valley. Instead, they drove out of their lives and straight into one of the most baffling mysteries in American history. When the sun rose on Saturday morning, the beds in Yuba City remained empty. The parents of the 5 men, Gary Matthias, Jack Madruga, Jackie Hewitt, Ted Wire, and Bill Sterling, knew instantly that something was terribly wrong. These weren't men who took spontaneous road trips or stayed out past their curfews. Their lives were governed by the strict gravity of routine. As the hours ticked by, the concern turned into a cold, sharp panic. Police reports were filed, phones rang endlessly in empty halls, and a search grid began to form across the region. But it wasn't until 4 days later, on February 28th, that the first piece of the puzzle was found, and it didn't fit anything they knew about the men. A park ranger patrolling the high-altitude service roads of the Plumas National Forest spotted the turquoise Mercury Montego. The discovery sparked a sudden surge of hope, but that hope was quickly extinguished by a wave of confusion. The car was found 70 miles off their intended route, deep in the mountains, parked on a road that was essentially a rugged trail for logging trucks. Why were they there? The drive from Chico to Yuba City is a straight shot through the valley. It is flat, easy, and warm. This mountain road, by contrast, was treacherous, winding, and buried under a thick layer of snow. But the true anomaly was the car itself. It wasn't crashed. It wasn't out of gas. When investigators finally reached the vehicle and inspected it, they found the gas tank was still a quarter full. The engine started immediately when they turned the key. The tires had been spun, certainly, and it was stuck in a small snowdrift. But 5 healthy grown men could have easily pushed it free in a matter of minutes. Instead, the evidence suggested a terrifying lack of logic. They had stopped the car, opened the doors, and simply walked away. They left a perfectly functional, heated vehicle to walk into the teeth of a mounting blizzard, wearing nothing but light jackets and basketball sneakers. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, and no damage to the car. There was just an abandoned sanctuary and a set of footprints leading deeper into the freezing dark. It was as if they had been beckoned by something only they could see. What compels a human being to abandon safety for certain death? This case, known to history as the Yuba County Five, has haunted investigators and true crime enthusiasts for over 40 years. The mystery endures not because of what we don't know, but because of the chilling nature of what we do know. Imagine for a moment the sharp bite of the mountain air, so cold it steals the breath from your lungs, and the absolute, crushing silence of a forest at midnight, where the only sound is the rhythmic creaking of frozen branches. The evidence we are about to uncover contradicts every basic instinct of human survival. In this investigation, we are going to walk the path they took that night, moving from the bright, cheering lights of a basketball gymnasium into the suffocating, ink-black darkness of the Plumas National Forest. We will examine the bizarre S left in the snow, the strange footprints that lead nowhere, and the car abandoned in a snowbank, perfectly functional and filled with fuel, yet left behind like a discarded toy. We will look at the baffling decisions made by the group, decisions that seem to defy logic and reason, leaving one to wonder what kind of whispered conversations took place in that freezing cabin. We'll explore the horrific discovery that awaited searchers months later when the spring thaw finally arrived, peeling back the heavy white shroud of winter to reveal a nightmare that no one was prepared to see. This isn't just a story about getting lost in the woods. It is a profound story about the fragility of the human mind and how fear can distort reality until salvation itself looks like a threat. As we peel back the layers of this tragedy, you will find yourself asking the same question the investigators did. What would you do in the freezing dark? Would you stay in the car, huddled together for warmth while the frost patterns crawled across the glass, and wait for the dawn to bring clarity? Or would you succumb to a mounting primal panic and run blindly into the trees? If you want to join us as we dissect the most psychological unsolved mystery of the 20th century, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. We investigate the darker corners of history every week, and you won't want to miss the deep dives we have planned for the future. The answers to this case are out there, buried under layers of pine needles and frozen earth, but be warned, the truth might be far more disturbing than the mystery itself. We need to look closely at every detail, because the smallest oversight, a misplaced key or a forgotten jacket, could be the key to understanding why 5 men walked to their dooms. Stay with us, because the details of what they found in that forest will change the way you think about the limits of human endurance and the thin line between safety and catastrophe. To truly understand the gravity of their situation, we must understand the environment they entered. The Plumas National Forest in February is not a place for the unprepared or the faint of heart. It is a vast, indifferent wilderness of towering pines and jagged granite ridges where the silence is absolute and the cold feels like a physical weight pressing against your chest. On the night the men disappeared, a massive winter storm was moving in. The temperature plummeted well below freezing, and the wind began to howl through the canopy, erasing the road beneath a blinding blanket of white. Visibility would have been near zero. In these conditions, the world shrinks to the few feet directly in front of your face. But we know now that the 5 men weren't the only ones on the mountain that night. A man named Joseph Shones had driven up the same treacherous road earlier in the day to check the snow levels for an upcoming ski trip. His car, too, had gotten stuck in the drifts, but unlike the 5 men, Shones was alone. As night fell and the blizzard intensified, he sat in his vehicle with the engine running to keep the heater going. It was then that he felt the crushing grip of a heart attack. Pain radiated through his chest and down his arm. He was incapacitated, terrified, and praying for a miracle. Through the fog of his pain and the swirling snow, Shones suddenly saw lights. Headlights. A car was coming up the road behind him. He watched, breathless, as the lights stopped. He saw flashlights bobbing in the darkness outside the vehicle. He heard the muffled sound of voices over the wind. Desperate for help, he called out into the night, screaming for attention with every bit of strength he had left. And this is where the nightmare begins to take shape. The moment he called out, the lights went dark. The voices stopped instantly. It was as if the people in that other car, the Mercury Montego, were hiding from him, or perhaps they were just as terrified as he was. Shons later reported seeing what looked like a group of men, and even more strangely, he thought he saw a woman holding a baby in the midst of the storm. Was this a hallucination born of pain and the fear of death? Or did he witness the Yuba County Five in their final moments of decision, terrified of something or someone that Shons couldn't see? The thought of those men standing in the dark, listening to a dying man's screams and choosing to run further into the woods, is a haunting image that suggests they weren't just lost. They were hunted by a fear we still don't fully understand. Before we follow them further into the woods, we need to know exactly who was in that car. These men weren't just statistics, they were individuals defined by their gentleness and their incredibly close bond. Ted Wire, at 32, was the oldest of the group. He was often described as a gentle giant in the truest sense of the phrase. He was tall and heavily built, but he possessed a childlike demeanor and always had a friendly wave for everyone he met. Ted loved cartoons and snacks, but he lacked what most would call common sense. He often needed gentle guidance for even the simplest tasks, relying on the structure provided by his family and his friends. Then there was Jack Madruga, the driver and the owner of the car. He was 30 years old and an Army veteran, though he had been discharged for what the military termed unsuitability. In his civilian life, he was known to be slow to process information, but he was also fiercely proud and protective of his independence. His car, that turquoise Mercury, was his prized possession. His family would later swear to investigators that Jack would never, under any circumstances, let someone else drive his car, nor would he ever leave it unlocked or abandoned on a dirt road if he had any other choice. Jackie Hewitt, the youngest at 24, was almost entirely dependent on his father and his best friend, Ted Wire. He struggled with basic tasks like dialing a telephone and had a severe over-reliance on the others for his sense of safety and direction. Bill Sterling was a man of deep, quiet faith. He was a religious soul who spent hours at the library and often volunteered to read to patients in mental hospitals, showing a level of patience and kindness that was rare. But the fifth man, Gary Mathias, was different from the rest. At 25, he was the outlier of the group. Mathias had served in the army in West Germany, but his service ended with a psychiatric discharge. He suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, and his past was volatile. He had a history of drug use and occasional violent outbursts when his condition went untreated. However, for the last 2 years, Gary had been a model citizen. He was taking his medication, stelazine and cogentine, religiously. He was lucid, he was calm, and he was working steadily in his stepfather's gardening business. He was the most physically capable member of the group, the only one with actual survival training, and the one who should have been their natural leader in a crisis. But he was also a man whose entire grip on reality was tethered to a small bottle of pills. And on that freezing night in the mountains, the investigators would find that the pills had been left behind. Without his medication, the man they relied on for leadership may have become their greatest liability, or perhaps the source of the very fear that drove them into the whiteout. To understand the sheer impossibility of this case, we have to return to the car. When the police investigation of the Mercury Montego began, the deputies didn't just find a vehicle. They found a series of contradictions that defied every rule of logic. As the search parties finally reached the car on that lonely mountain road, they didn't approach it with the expectation of a simple breakdown. Given the strange circumstances, they moved in with their guns drawn, half expecting an ambush or a grisly crime scene hidden behind the glass. But what they found instead was a tableau of eerie, unsettling calmness. The car sat there, a bright turquoise and white ghost against the white snow, perfectly preserved. It was unlocked, almost as if the occupants expected to return at any moment. One of the windows had been left rolled down several inches, allowing the swirling mountain snow to drift inside and settle in a thin, cold layer across the upholstery. Inside the cabin, the remnants of the men's final happy hours were scattered about like a forgotten picnic. There were empty soda cans, maps that had been consulted and discarded, and the crinkled wrappers from the hostess pies and Snickers bars they had purchased in Chico. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, and no indication that anything violent had occurred within those 4 doors. But as the investigators looked closer at the mechanics of the vehicle, the story became even more disturbing. The Mercury Montego was a low-clearance sedan, a car built for city streets and flat highways, not for the rugged, rutted service roads of the High Sierras. Anyone who has ever navigated a logging road in a passenger car knows the constant fear of bottoming out, of the sound of rocks scraping against the oil pan. And yet, when the mechanics inspected the undercarriage of Jack Madruga's car, they found it was completely pristine. There were no dents, no deep gouges, and no signs that the car had been driven with anything less than extreme, painstaking precision. This suggests that whoever was behind the wheel that night didn't race up the mountain in a blind panic. They drove deliberately. They navigated the rocks and the ruts with a steady hand, moving deeper into the wilderness with a purpose that remains unknown to this day. Furthermore, the car wasn't even truly stuck. It had been high-centered on a small, soft snowbank, but the tires still had traction. If the 5 men, 5 healthy, capable adults, had simply stepped out and given the bumper a coordinated push, they would have been free in a matter of minutes. They could have turned the car around. They could have sat inside with the heater running, protected from the storm by a full tank of gas and a perfectly functional battery. The vehicle was a life raft in a frozen ocean, and yet for reasons we may never truly comprehend, they treated it like a tomb. They abandoned a warm, safe sanctuary to walk directly into the heart of a blizzard. This wasn't a mechanical necessity, it was a psychological choice. It was a decision that suggests they weren't running away from the storm, but rather they were running towards something else, or perhaps they were fleeing a terror that existed only in the shadows of their own minds. As news of the abandoned car reached Yuba City, the families of the 5 men were plunged into a state of inconsolable grief and mounting suspicion. When the police first suggested that the boys might have simply taken a wrong turn and gotten themselves lost, the parents pushed back with a fierce, desperate certainty. They knew these men better than anyone, and the official narrative simply didn't fit the people they had raised. Jack Madruga's mother, Imogene, was particularly adamant in her disbelief. She spoke to reporters with a voice trembling with both sorrow and conviction, stating that her son hated the cold with a passion. He was a man who knew his Mercury Montego inside and out. It was his pride and joy, and he treated it with a level of care that bordered on obsession. He wouldn't walk 5 feet in the snow if he didn't have to, and she insisted. The families described the group as routine-oriented to a fault. These were men of habit, men who found comfort in the predictable rhythm of their daily lives. The idea that they would spontaneously decide to drive nearly 2 hours in the wrong direction, up a treacherous mountain road in the middle of a winter night, was more than just unlikely. It was impossible. The prevailing theory among the families, whispered in living rooms and shared with investigators, was that the boys had been coerced. They believed with every fiber of their being that someone had hijacked the car. Perhaps a confrontation at the basketball game in Chico had spiraled out of control, or maybe they had crossed paths with the wrong person at a stoplight. The families imagined a scenario where a stranger had forced them at gunpoint to drive into the wilderness, intending to leave them there to perish. Investigators took these concerns seriously and began looking into every possible lead. They tracked down the clerk at the convenience store where the men had stopped for snacks just before leaving Chico. The clerk remembered them clearly, and his testimony only added to the mystery. He described them as laughing and joking, acting entirely normal, and seemingly without a care in the world. There was no shadowy figure lurking in the background of the store, no sign of distress on their faces, and no one following them when they pulled out of the parking lot. This massive gap between the happy, carefree group at the store and the empty, snow-covered car in the woods created a vacuum of information that was quickly filled with a sense of impending dread. If they weren't forced by a gunman, what force on earth was strong enough to make Jack Madruga leave his beloved car behind? What fear was potent enough to make 5 grown men walk into the freezing dark with no supplies? The police began to quietly consider the fear factor, the possibility that they weren't running from a physical person, but rather a shared delusion or a sudden cascading panic that had swept through the group like a fever. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the silence from the forest became a deafening answer. Somewhere in those mountains, a secret was being kept, and the families were left to wonder if they would ever see their sons again. It was a weight that would test the limits of their sanity as they searched for a truth that seemed to retreat further into the shadows with every passing day. To understand where the men went after they stepped out of the safety of the Mercury, we have to look closely at the map of the Plumas National Forest. The road they were on, the Oro-Quincy Road, didn't just lead to nowhere. It wound its way deeper and deeper into the high Sierra wilderness, an area that is notoriously unforgiving during the winter months. But unknown to the men, or perhaps known only to one of them who might have caught a glimpse of a map, there was a structure located 19 miles further up that very road. It was a trailer maintained by the U.S. Forest Service, known as the Daniel Zink Trailer. This wasn't just a simple camper left behind by a weekend traveler. It was a sturdy, weatherproof base of operations intended for work crews and rangers. During the warmer months, it served as a hub for logging and forest management, and it was specifically designed to withstand the brutal mountain winters. In the early months of 1978, that trailer was a lonely beacon of civilization in a vast white void. It sat in a small clearing, almost entirely buried under a heavy drift of snow. But inside its thin metal walls, it held the absolute promise of life. The trailer was equipped with everything a person would need to survive an extended stay in the wilderness. It had real beds with mattresses. It was stocked with heavy, industrial-grade wool blankets that could ward off the most biting chill. Most importantly, it featured a professional propane heating system and a cooking stove. But the most significant resource was the pantry. Inside the storage lockers were dozens of sea rations, military-grade canned food designed to keep soldiers nourished and alive in the harshest field conditions. There were cans of fruit, spaghetti, beef, and even desserts. There were matches, paper for starting fires, and a collection of books to pass the time. For anyone lost in the wild, stumbling upon this trailer would be like finding a winning lottery ticket in the middle of a graveyard. It was a miracle waiting to happen, a sanctuary that could have turned a tragedy into a story of survival. However, the trailer was 19 miles away from where the car was abandoned. That is a brutal uphill hike through terrain that was covered in snow, waist-deep in many places. It is a distance that would be a challenge for an experienced hiker in full gear, let alone 5 men wearing nothing but light jackets and basketball sneakers. And yet, the tracks that were discovered much later suggested the impossible. They made the trek. They pushed through the freezing wind and the deep drifts, walking through a literal hell on earth to reach this metal heaven. But as we would soon discover, finding the shelter was only the beginning of a much darker chapter. The trailer wasn't just a place of salvation. It was the setting for a slow, methodical tragedy that would leave investigators questioning everything they knew about human behavior. They had reached the goal, but for reasons that still haunt the case, they found that even in a room full of food and warmth, the shadows of the mountain had followed them inside. Winter eventually broke its grip on the high Sierras. The relentless storms ceased, the sun returned to the peaks, and the massive snowpack that had imprisoned the mountain began to recede, turning into muddy, rushing streams that carved through the landscape. It was June 4th, 1978, nearly 4 months since the 5 men had vanished into the night. A group of motorcyclists, looking to take advantage of the clearing roads, decided to ride up toward the Forest Service trailer for a weekend excursion. As they approached the clearing where the trailer sat, the fresh scent of pine and melting snow was suddenly overpowered by something much darker. It was a scent that anyone who has encountered it never forgets, the sweet, heavy, and unmistakable smell of decay. The riders noticed that one of the windows on the trailer had been smashed from the outside. With a sense of mounting dread, they approached the door and pushed it open. The sight that greeted them inside was the stuff of absolute nightmares. A scene so macabre, it felt like a staged horror film. Lying on one of the beds, wrapped tightly in 8 separate layers of thin white bedsheets, was the body of Ted Wire. The gentle giant was no longer a giant. When he had disappeared back in February, Ted was a robust man who weighed over 200 pounds. The body lying on that bed was a skeletal shadow of his former self, weighing barely 100 pounds. The most striking detail, however, was his face. Ted had successfully grown a thick, heavy beard during his time in the trailer. Based on the length of that beard and the state of his remains, forensic experts would later estimate that he had lived for a significant amount of time after the car was abandoned. Some estimates suggested he had survived for 8 weeks. Others believed he might have held on for as long as 13 weeks. Think about the implications of that timeline for a moment. 13 weeks. That means Ted Wire didn't die on the night of the blizzard. He didn't freeze to death in the woods 24 hours after leaving the car. He lived for months inside that metal container. He lay there on that bed as the seasons slowly shifted outside, watching the snow pile up against the windows and then, eventually, begin to melt. He spent his final days in total isolation, slowly wasting away as his body consumed itself to stay alive. But the discovery of his body wasn't the end of the mystery. It was merely the beginning of the true horror. As the motorcyclists and later the investigators looked around the room, they realized the cruel, sickening irony of the scene. Ted Wire had spent his final moments in a state of prolonged agony, starving to death while sitting in the middle of a fully stocked kitchen. He was surrounded by the very things that could have saved him, yet he remained wrapped in his shroud, waiting for an end that took months to arrive. The question of why he didn't help himself would become the central, haunting pivot of the entire investigation. The scene inside the Forest Service trailer defied every law of human logic and survival instinct. When the investigators performed the autopsy on Ted Wire, they confirmed the grim reality. He had died from a combination of starvation and hypothermia. But as they looked around the small space where he spent his final weeks, it became clear that neither of those things should have ever happened. Directly outside the trailer stood a large propane tank, which was found to be nearly full of gas. The main valve was closed tight. All Ted, or anyone who might have been with him, had to do was turn a simple brass knob, and the trailer would have been flooded with life-saving heat. They could have been warm, even in the middle of a blizzard. Instead, they chose to freeze in the dark. But the situation with the food was even more baffling, bordering on the impossible. Investigators opened the storage lockers in the pantry and found dozens upon dozens of sea ration cans. Some of the cans had been opened. Roughly 30 of them had been consumed over the course of those months. But there were still lockers filled to the brim with unopened food. There was enough high-calorie, military-grade nourishment to keep all 5 men alive and healthy for a year or more. And here is the detail that truly keeps investigators awake at night. A military-grade P-38 can opener was found sitting right there on the counter. They had the tool. They had the food. They had the shelter. Ted Wire lost half of his total body weight while sitting mere inches away from a buffet that could have saved his life 10 times over. Why would a starving man, someone who had already opened 30 cans, suddenly stop? Why would a freezing man not turn the valve for heat? The evidence suggests a level of psychological paralysis so profound that it completely overrode the most basic biological imperative to survive. It implies that at some point the men became afraid, not of the cold, but of something else. They were afraid to eat, afraid to get warm, and perhaps most tellingly, afraid to make their presence known to the outside world. It was as if they were waiting for a permission that never came, or hiding from a threat that they believed was standing just outside the door. If you are finding this case as deeply unsettling as we are, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. We are dedicated to exploring these darker corners of human history, and we need to build our own community of investigators to try and make sense of stories that defy explanation. The more we look into the Yuba County Five, the more it feels like we are staring into a void of human psychology. Was it a shared psychosis? Was it the influence of Gary Mathias, whose medication was long gone? Or was there something else in those woods that night? Something that turned a group of friends into a collection of terrified shadows? The truth is buried deep, but we are going to keep digging until we find whatever remains. With the tragic discovery of Ted Wire, the search for the remaining 4 men intensified to a fever pitch. The forest, which had successfully hidden them beneath a shroud of white for months, finally began to give them up as the summer heat took hold. 11 miles away from the trailer, in the opposite direction of the car, searchers stumbled upon the scattered remains of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling. It appeared that they had perished long before they could reach the relative safety of the Forest Service shelter. They had succumbed to the elements on the long, brutal hike up the mountain, their bodies eventually scavenged by the local wildlife, leaving only weathered bones to tell the story of their final moments. Then, just 2 days later, a discovery was made that broke the heart of the entire community. Jackie Hewitt's father, who had joined the search parties in a desperate final bid for closure, found his own son's backbone lying under a manzanita bush. Jackie's skull was found a short distance away. It was a devastating end to the search for the families, a confirmation of their worst fears in the most visceral way possible. But as the coroner began to examine the remains and piece together a timeline, a strange connection started to spark. Jack Madruga was found with the keys to the Mercury Montego still tucked safely in his pocket. He had died while walking away from the very car that could have saved him. And then there was the matter of the items found with Ted Wire in the trailer. On the bedside table next to Ted's emaciated body was a gold watch. When the families were shown the watch, they were baffled. It didn't belong to Ted. It was a piece of jewelry that none of the men were known to own, yet it had been placed there with care. Even more chilling was a piece of paper found nearby with a series of dates scribbled on it in a shaky hand. The dates tracked the passage of time within the trailer, a grim calendar of their exile. But the dates stopped abruptly, long before Ted would have finally passed away. It was as if someone had been keeping time, marking the days they spent waiting in the dark, until the timekeeper himself simply disappeared or lost the will to continue. The group had clearly fractured. The strong had fallen early on the trail, or perhaps in a moment of ultimate desperation, the strong had abandoned the weak to their fate. This leaves us with the final, most haunting piece of the puzzle. 4 of the men were now accounted for, their fates sealed by the mountain. But Gary Mathias, the man with the military training, the man with the history of schizophrenia, the man who was missing his vital medication, was nowhere to be found. His survival gear was missing, and his trail went cold at the edge of the clearing. He is the missing link in this tragedy, the one person who might have known exactly what happened in that trailer during those long, silent months. At this point in our investigation, we have accounted for 4 of the 5 men who drove away from Chico that night. We found Ted Wire, emaciated and frozen in the Forest Service trailer. We found the scattered remains of Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, and Jackie Hewitt in the unforgiving woods surrounding that shelter. But that leaves one man whose fate remains a total void in the official record. We are talking about Gary Mathias. He was the Army veteran, the man with the survival training, and the man who suffered from a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. Gary was the most physically capable of the group, and yet he is the only one who has never been found. Not a single bone, not a shred of his olive-drab field jacket, and not a trace of his presence has ever been recovered from the Plumas National Forest. However, we know for a fact that Gary Mathias made it to that trailer. When investigators first entered the shelter, they found a piece of evidence that placed him there beyond any shadow of a doubt. His own tennis shoes were sitting on the floor. This single detail tells us a story of survival and a tragic exchange. It suggests that Gary arrived at the trailer alongside Ted Wire. Perhaps he was the one who broke the window to gain entry. He likely helped Ted, whose feet were severely frostbitten and swollen, into the bed and wrapped him in those 8 layers of sheets. But at some point, Gary Mathias decided he could no longer stay in that metal sanctuary. He took Ted Wire's leather shoes, which were a larger size and would have been more comfortable for someone whose own feet were beginning to swell from the cold, and he walked back out into the whiteout. We have to ask ourselves what was happening in Gary's mind during those weeks. Remember, Gary had left his vital medication, his stelazine and cogentin, back in the car. After days or weeks in the wilderness, the chemical withdrawal would have been catastrophic. The steady, lucid version of Gary Mathias would have slowly dissolved, replaced by the return of vivid hallucinations and a crushing sense of paranoia. Did Gary believe they were being hunted by something in the woods? Did he look at the lockers full of food and see a trap? It is entirely possible that he told Ted not to eat the sea rations because he believed they were poisoned. He might have forbidden Ted from turning on the propane heat because he feared the smoke would give away their position to an imaginary enemy. The presence of Gary's discarded shoes implies he was the last one standing, the caretaker who stayed to watch over his friend, but also the unintended jailer who may have enforced a set of rules born entirely of madness. If we try to reconstruct those final, agonizing weeks inside the trailer, a truly heartbreaking and haunting picture begins to emerge from the silence of the forest. We know from the forensic evidence that Ted Wire was alive for a long time, possibly up to 3 months, huddled under a mountain of blankets as the winter air turned the trailer into a literal icebox. We also know that he was likely bedridden, his feet blackened and swollen by gangrene, making him entirely dependent on someone else for his basic survival. He couldn't have walked to the food locker, even if he had the strength to stand. Someone had to be there to help him, to offer a bit of comfort in that desolate place. And the evidence points directly to Gary Mathias. The investigators found that several sea ration cans had been opened and consumed, and they were opened with a P38 can opener. This is a specific military-grade tool that requires a certain level of training and manual dexterity to use effectively. You can almost hear the sound of that small metal tool clicking rhythmically against the tin, the only noise in the room, besides the whistling wind outside. Of the 5 men, only Gary Mathias and Jack Madruga had the military background to be familiar with a P-38. Since we know Jack Madruga perished on the road miles away, Gary is the only logical candidate for the person who was feeding Ted and keeping him company during those long, dark nights. But this leads us to the most haunting question of all. Why did they stop? Why did they consume only a fraction of the available food when there was enough to last them until the summer thaw? The answer likely lies in a psychological phenomenon known as learned helplessness, magnified by the terrifying lens of untreated psychosis. Gary Mathias was the dominant personality in the group. He was the veteran, the leader, and the one with the survival skills. If Gary, in the throes of a schizophrenic episode, told the gentle and highly suggestible Ted that they had to ration their supplies for a long-term siege, Ted would have believed him without a second thought. He would have watched Gary's face for any sign of hope, finding only the blank stare of a man lost in his own mind. If Gary insisted that the propane heater was a beacon for their pursuers, Ted would have shivered in the dark without question, his breath coming in shallow puffs of white mist as the temperature inside the trailer plummeted, the dynamic in that small frozen space. 2 men huddled together as the wind howled and rattled the thin metal walls of the trailer. One man is slowly dying from infection and the slow, agonizing drain of hunger, while the other is slowly losing his grip on reality, his thoughts spiraling into a world of shadows and invisible threats. They were surrounded by everything they needed to survive, warmth, food, and shelter, but they were trapped in a psychological prison of their own making. The tension of the story peaks when we realize that eventually Gary Mathias simply left. He might have set down the can opener one last time, adjusted his heavy coat, and walked out into the knee-deep snow. Perhaps he was chasing a hallucination that promised a way home. Or perhaps he was fleeing a threat that only he could see in the dark timber. And he left Ted Wire behind. He left him alone, wrapped in a shroud of thin bedsheets, staring at a locker full of food he didn't dare touch, waiting for a friend who would never return, as the heavy silence of the woods finally claimed the trailer for good. Now, after decades of speculation, the pieces of this puzzle finally begin to snap together into a picture of absolute, tragic devastation. We have the functional car, the mysterious witness Joseph Shons, and the starving man in the pantry. When we look at all of these elements together, we can see the trigger for this entire nightmare. It wasn't a monster or a mountain lion. It was a moment of shared, cascading delusion. When the boys first drove up that mountain, they likely made a simple, honest mistake, a wrong turn on a dark road that felt increasingly unfamiliar with every mile. But when the Mercury Montego got stuck in that small snowdrift, something shifted from a minor inconvenience into a full-blown, suffocating panic. The engine may have still been humming and the heater blowing warm air against their ankles, but the psychological walls were already closing in as the frost began to crawl up the corners of the windshield. This is where Joseph Shons becomes the most important figure in the story. Remember, he was lying in his own car nearby, suffering from a heart attack and screaming for help into the empty frozen night. His voice would have carried through the trees, muffled by the falling snow, but still sharp enough to pierce the silence. To a group of men who were already lost and confused, a man screaming in the pitch-black woods wasn't a victim in need of rescue. To Gary Mathias, who was likely already spiraling into a paranoid episode without his medication, that voice was a threat. It was a trap laid by an unseen enemy. Gary likely felt a cold prickle of fear on the back of his neck as he peered into the ink-black woods, his heart racing. "Turn off the lights!" he might have ordered, his voice sharp and commanding. He might have reached out and clicked the headlights off himself, plunging the group into a terrifying, absolute darkness where the only sound was their own heavy breathing. And because they trusted him, they listened. They abandoned a warm, safe, and perfectly functional car because Gary told them it was a target. They walked 19 brutal miles into a blizzard, the thin shoes sinking into the rising drifts and their breath coming in ragged gasps, because Gary convinced them that the only way to survive was to escape into the high country. Once they reached the trailer, the paranoia didn't end. It simply changed shape and settled into the very marrow of their bones. They didn't eat all the food because Gary was rationing it for a war that didn't exist, his mind constructing a complex narrative of pursuit. They didn't turn on the heat because Gary feared that any light or smoke would lead their enemies straight to them, even as the temperature inside the metal walls dropped well below freezing. The Yuba County Five didn't die because of a mechanical failure or a lack of supplies. They died because the fractured reality of one man overwrote the reality of the other four. They starved to death, not from a lack of food, but from an excess of trust in a leader whose mind had betrayed him. The true horror of this case isn't found in the shadows of the trees. It's the realization that 5 men can walk right off the edge of the world simply because they were told to keep marching. They followed their friend into the dark, and they followed him all the way to the end, leaving behind a car that could have saved them if they had only stayed inside. This is the visceral horror that lingers long after the facts of the case have been laid out. It is the image of Ted Wire, lying in that trailer for weeks on end, his breath hitching in the frigid, stagnant air. The interior of the trailer would have been a hollow metallic chamber where every gust of wind sounded like a roar against the thin walls. We have to assume he was lucid enough to feel the agonizing gnaw of hunger in his stomach, a sharp, twisting pain that eventually faded into a dull, hollow ache as his body began to consume itself. He would have been able to smell the faint metallic scent of the food lockers just a few feet away, perhaps even envisioning the labels on the cans of peaches and meat that sat untouched in the darkness. But the psychological barrier erected by his absolute trust in Gary Mathias was stronger than any physical lock on a door. It is a staggering testament to the power of human influence and the profound vulnerability of the mind when it is stripped of its routine and safety. In that dim, frozen space, the very rules of reality had shifted, and Ted obeyed a logic that only he and Gary understood, even as the frost patterns crept further across the windows. Socially, these 5 men were raised to be followers. They were taught to respect authority, to listen to those who knew more than they did, and above all, to stick together no matter what. On the sun-drenched basketball courts of Yuba City, these traits were their greatest strengths, the very things that made them the boys. They shared a bond built on predictable days, shared meals, and a sense of belonging that most people never find. But in the isolation of the Plumas National Forest, as the shadows lengthened and the snow piled up against the trailer door, those same virtues became a collective death sentence. They stayed together when their only hope for survival was to split up and seek help. They followed their leader when they should have rebelled, looking to Gary for guidance he was no longer capable of providing. They adhered to a plan that was born of a chemical imbalance and a growing madness. A plan that led them deeper into the suffocating silence of the pines. And what of Gary? If he did walk out of that trailer after Ted became too weak to move, where could he have gone? He would have stepped out into a pitch-black wilderness where the silence of the forest presses in from all sides. Did he finally succumb to the cold in a hidden ravine, his body covered by decades of falling needles and rotting brush? The terrain there is an unforgiving labyrinth of granite and dense forest that guards its secrets well. Or is it possible he made it further than anyone imagined, fueled by a manic energy that defied the elements? Over the years, a few scattered reports surfaced of a man matching his description in small mountain towns, a hollow-eyed stranger glimpsed in a quiet diner or walking along a lonely stretch of highway. But they were always dismissed as hearsay. The ghost of Gary Mathias haunts this story because he represents the chaotic element that can dismantle order in an instant. He is the ultimate reminder that our survival as a species depends not just on our physical supplies, but on the stability of our sanity. The Forest Service trailer was a sanctuary, a fully stocked lifeboat in a frozen sea, and because of a single man's fear, they turned it into a coffin for them all. The tragedy lies in the fact that the door was never locked. The only thing keeping them from life was the darkness within. The aftermath of the discovery in the mountains left the small community of Yuba City completely shattered. For the families, there was no sense of closure, only a series of questions that cut like knives every time they were revisited in the heavy silence of their homes. The Madrugas, the Hewitts, the Sterlings, and the Vyers were forced to bury their sons with the heavy, unbearable knowledge that their deaths were entirely preventable. They spent many long afternoons sitting by windows, watching the rain hit the glass, while the smell of stale coffee and old photographs filled the room. They had to live with the haunting image of that turquoise car, sitting perfectly fine in the snow, and the trailer full of food that their children never ate. The Mathias family was left in a unique kind of limbo, a purgatory where they had no body to bury, and the crushing burden of knowing their son likely played the central role in the tragedy of his best friends. They kept Gary's favorite jacket hanging by the door for years, a silent woolen reminder of a life that simply vanished into the timber. In the years that followed, accusations were whispered in grocery store aisles, and grief often curdled into a sharp, defensive anger. But as the investigation stalled and no new evidence appeared, the case eventually went cold. The thick files in the sheriff's department began to gather dust, the paper turning yellow and brittle in the dark drawers of filing cabinets, and the public's attention drifted toward newer tragedies. The Forest Service trailer, the site of so much silent suffering, was eventually hauled away, and the clearing was slowly reclaimed by the encroaching forest. The grass grew over the tire ruts, and the wildflowers bloomed where the men had once shivered in the dark, erasing the physical scars of that terrible winter. Today, if you were to drive that rugged service road in the height of summer, you would find nothing but a bumpy track through the trees and the occasional rusted logging cable coiled like a snake in the brush. The air up there is thin and carries the scent of sun-baked pine and dry earth. You would never know, just by looking at the landscape as the golden sunlight filters through the branches, that on a winter night in 1978, 5 men walked this path into total oblivion. The case remains technically open, but the probability of finding Gary Mathias or any new answers at this late stage is virtually non-existent. The Yuba County Five have transitioned from a local missing persons case into a cautionary legend, a piece of dark folklore that belongs to the Sierra Nevada. They are remembered as the boys who walked away from the warmth of a running engine, the boys who starved in the middle of a grocery store, and most tragically, the boys who simply listened to the wrong voice in the dark. Their memory lingers like the winter frost, a chilling reminder of the fragility of the human mind. We like to believe that the survival instinct is the strongest force in all of nature. We tell ourselves that if we were the ones freezing in that trailer, we would have smashed every window and broken every lock. We tell ourselves that if we were starving, we would have found a way to open those cans. We want to believe that we would always choose life, no matter the cost. But the story of the Yuba County Five challenges that comfortable arrogance. It shows us that the human mind is a fragile instrument, easily decalibrated by fear, by misplaced trust, and by a confusion that can turn a sanctuary into a prison. Reality, as it turns out, is entirely subjective. To Ted Wire, that locker full of food wasn't nourishment, it was something forbidden. To the rest of the boys, that warm car wasn't safety, it was a target for an enemy they couldn't see. As you go about your routine tonight, locking your doors and settling into the comfort of your home, take a moment to remember them. Remember how thin the line truly is between a safe drive home and a walk into the infinite dark. And remember that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can encounter in the wilderness isn't the cold or the wolves, it's the voice in the dark that tells you the wrong way is the only way out. If you've stayed with us through this journey into the Plumas National Forest, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. We dive into the most baffling and psychological mysteries of our past every single week, and your support helps us keep these stories alive. Stay curious, stay skeptical of the shadows, and most importantly, stay warm out there. We'll see you in the next investigation.